I've been an EMT for about 4 years now, so I've seen my share of strange calls. People do weird things when they panic, and emergencies never go by the book, but this one has stuck with me. It was a weeknight, middle of January, freezing cold. I live and work in a semi-rural area. My partner was out sick, so I was paired with a new guy for the night shift. He seemed fine, a little quiet, but he was competent. We were just a few hours in when we got a call. Elderly male, unresponsive, possible cardiac arrest. The address was on the outskirts of town, out in this older neighborhood with those big colonial-style houses that all looked the same. We pulled up to the house a little before midnight. It was a 2-story weathered building with peeling paint and an overgrown yard. No lights were on. There had been a big storm earlier that day, so I figured the power was either out for the caller or they hadn't thought to turn the lights on in the panic. My partner grabbed the bag while I went to knock on the door. No answer. I tried again, louder this time. Nothing. I looked back at the street, half expecting a neighbor to come running out or something, but the whole block was dark and quiet. Finally, I tried the door. It was unlocked. I called out as I pushed it open, announcing who we were and why we were there. No response. The air inside was stale and cold. I could see my breath as I stepped into the hallway. It was pitch black in there, so I turned on my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating old wallpaper, dusty furniture, and a narrow staircase leading up. Some of the places you get called to as an EMT can be pretty gnarly, and this one felt particularly weird. I called out again, and still nothing. My partner was behind me, muttering that maybe we should call for backup. We walked down the main hallway of the building, continuing to call out. Finally, we found a bedroom at the back of the first floor. That's where we found him. He was lying on his back in bed, almost naked, eyes wide open, mouth slack. Nobody else was around. At first glance, I thought he was already dead, but then his chest moved, just barely. He was breathing, but shallow and irregular. We had no idea where the person who made the call was. We called out again, but there was no response. I thought it was possible they had run to a neighbor's house, but it seemed completely bizarre to leave the guy alone here. I went to check the man's pulse while my partner started prepping the oxygen. That's when I noticed his arms. They were strapped down. Not with medical restraints or anything like that. Someone had tied his wrists to the bedposts with torn bed sheets. His ankles were bound the same way. It was at this point that it started to dawn on me that the situation was more complicated than we had been told. I started to untie him, talking to him the whole time, trying to get any kind of response. His eyes flicked toward me just for a second and his mouth moved, but no sound came out. He looked terrified. As I worked the knots loose, something felt off. The knots weren't tight, more like loops that had been quickly wrapped. His right wrist wasn't even fully secured. The realization landed like a dull, resonant thud. These weren't restraints meant to keep someone in place. They were meant to make it look that way. My partner must have sensed something too. He stopped what he was doing and muttered, "These knots are..." That's when the old man moved. In a blink, his free hand lashed out, grabbing my wrist. His eyes were wide and wild and locked onto mine. Before I could react, he yanked himself free from the remaining restraints and lunged at me, knocking me backward onto the floor. I scrambled, trying to push him off, but he was wiry and fast. He let out this low, guttural sound, half growl, half sob as he clawed at my arms, trying to pin me down. I didn't have any idea what he wanted. He was just thrashing at me. My partner was shouting, fumbling for something, but I couldn't focus on anything except the weight pressing down on me and the sheer panic surging through my body. Then as suddenly as it started, it was over. The old man's expression changed, like something inside him clicked back into place. For a second, he just stared at me. Then without warning, he got up and bolted out of the room. He shoved past my partner, sprinting out of the room and disappeared down the hallway. By the time we got to our feet and ran after him, the front door was hanging open. Cold air was pouring inside. He was gone. We searched the yard and the street, but there was nothing. When the police arrived, they combed the area, but there were no fresh footprints in the snow, and no sign of where he went. We gave our statements, but there was no real explanation. The house was evidently abandoned. There was no record of anyone living there, let alone an elderly man in need of medical attention. We also never found out how he placed the call, or if someone else was there with him that we didn't see. The creepiest part is knowing that we weren't there to save him. It was him who was waiting for us. I participated in a sleep study last year, thinking it would be an easy way to make some extra cash. I've always been a poor sleeper, and I wake up exhausted a lot, so not only was I getting paid to participate in the study, I was hopeful I might find a solution. The setup was simple. I had to wear a monitor on my wrist and set up a small camera in my room that I would turn on at night to record my sleep patterns. The researchers told me it was part of some larger study about circadian rhythms or something. It actually paid pretty decent, and I was still in college at the time. I was living in a small apartment with another woman. We weren't close, but we didn't have any issues with each other. We'd both answered the same roommate ad and kept to ourselves most of the time. We kept pretty different hours. She would work late and sleep during the day, and I was the opposite. She was quiet, always in her room, and polite. I didn't initially tell her that I was participating in the study, but if I was happy with how it ended, I was going to recommend it to her as an easy way to make some extra money. The first couple nights went by without incident. I almost forgot about the camera altogether. I'd fall asleep, wake up, and carry on with my day. Then I got a call from the researchers asking me to come in. They said it was routine, just to check in and make sure all the equipment was working properly. I went to their office and they brought me into a small room with a computer. One of them explained that they'd reviewed the footage from my sleep sessions so far and found something unusual. They asked if I'd given anyone permission to check on me while I slept. I shook my head, feeling a chill run through me. They exchanged a look before turning the screen toward me. The video showed me lying in bed, asleep. The timestamp in the corner read 3:17 a.m. At first I didn't understand. Everything was normal, just me breathing softly and the faint sound of traffic outside my window. But then the door to my bedroom opened. I watched, totally dumbfounded, as a figure entered my room. At first, I had no idea who it was, but then, as they stepped closer to my bed, just enough for their face to catch some of the ambient light from the street lamp outside my window, I could see who it was. It was my roommate. She stood there, inches from my bed, just staring at me. I couldn't tell how long she stayed because they skipped through the footage, but she didn't move. She just stood there, looking down at me while I slept. From the angle of the camera, I couldn't see her face, but it sort of looked like her mouth was moving. Then she reached out and ran her hand over my hair, before turning and closing the door behind her as if nothing had happened. They ended the video. The researchers asked if I knew why she would be checking in on me in the middle of the night like that. I told them no, and that we didn't really know each other very well. They offered to call the police, but I declined, worrying about confronting her and escalating things. I told them I'd handle it myself. I went home feeling exposed and vulnerable in my own space. My roommate wasn't there, so I locked myself in my room and tried to process what I'd seen. I convinced myself that there had to be a reasonable explanation, even if I didn't know what it was. That she had been sleepwalking and I must have left my bedroom door unlocked. I decided I would confront her when I saw her the next day. That night I tried to sleep, but every creak of the apartment made my heart race. I kept imagining her standing in my room, just watching me. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke up in the dark to the sound of my doorknob lock quietly popping open and the hinges of the door creaking. I played dead, barely breathing and saw her silhouette standing in the doorway. She didn't move. She just stood there, completely still. My voice shook as I asked her what she was doing, but she didn't respond. At this point, I was convinced she must have been sleepwalking, but I had no idea where she got the key to my room. She took one step into the room and I just panicked and screamed. She suddenly turned around and ran out of the room, slamming the door behind her. I heard her footsteps racing down the hall, the front door flying open, and then silence. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I packed my things the next morning and left without seeing her. The landlord was mostly understanding, but I could tell they thought I was making it up or being melodramatic or something. I broke the lease and had to pay a fee out of my savings, but I didn't care. I was not going back to that apartment. I moved in with a friend for the next month until I was able to find another place. I still have nightmares of waking up to her standing over me, just watching me while I'm sleeping. Before I got my current position at the hospital, I used to work as an overnight caregiver. It was the kind of job where you stay in a client's home to help with whatever they need. Most of the time, it was elderly people whose families hired someone to make sure they didn't fall or forget to take their medications or whatever. It was quiet work, sometimes boring, but it was experience and paid decently. One of the assignments I had still keeps me up at night, though. It was a last-minute shift. My usual client had been admitted to the hospital, so my agency sent me to cover for another caregiver who had called out. They gave me the address and a quick rundown. It was an older man in his mid-70s recovering from a surgery and developing dementia, mostly independent but needed some help at night. I arrived around 8 p.m. The man's adult daughter met me at the door. She seemed stressed, barely making eye contact as she rushed through the instructions. He didn't sleep well, she said, and sometimes he got confused at night. There was a baby monitor on the kitchen counter so I could hear him if he needed me. She thanked me for coming in such short notice, then left in a hurry. The patient was already in bed when I peeked in to introduce myself. He was thin, pale, and looked exhausted. He barely responded when I greeted him, just a slight nod. Figuring he needed to rest, I left him alone and settled in for the night. For the next few hours, everything was normal. I sat in the living room scrolling through my phone, listening to the soft crackle of the baby monitor. Occasionally, he coughed or shifted in bed, but otherwise the house was silent. Then, a little after midnight, I heard something. Not from the baby monitor, from inside the house. It was soft at first, like fabric brushing against a wall. I muted the monitor and listened. There was a faint creak, like a footstep pressing into an old floorboard. I stood up and slowly walked toward the hallway. The house was dark, but a dim nightlight cast shadows along the floor. I glanced toward the man's room. His door was still shut. I turned the corner toward the kitchen. Nothing. I flipped on the light, scanning the room. Everything was in its proper place. The whole house felt completely still. The back door was locked, as it should have been, and the windows were closed. I had no other conclusion to draw but that I was imagining things and being paranoid, that old houses made noises and I was just tired and working myself up. Then I returned to the living room. Eventually, I sat down and was able to get myself to relax for a bit. At about 2:30 a.m., the baby monitor crackled to life. At first, it was just the rustling of sheets, then breathing, deep and uneven. Then a whisper. "You shouldn't be here." I went dead still. The patient's voice was hoarse, almost pleading. I picked up the monitor and listened. There was a silence. I put down the baby monitor and walked to his room. I knocked lightly outside and then opened the door. His bed was empty. The sheets were pulled back and the blankets were rumpled at the bottom of the bed. His bathroom door was open, but the light was off. I called his name, but there was no response. I left his bedroom, checked the other rooms, and walked down the hall to the kitchen. Then I saw it. The back door, the one I had checked earlier, it was unlocked. I immediately spiraled into a panic. I grabbed my phone and dialed his daughter's number. She didn't answer. I tried to calm myself down and took a few deep breaths. I decided I would do a quick search of the outside of the property and then call the police if I still couldn't find him. I walked back to the front door, got my jacket, and was in the process of putting on my shoes when I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, quiet footsteps, like someone was sneaking across the wooden boards. I remember I stopped breathing, still hunched over, shoelaces in hand. The footsteps ended right outside the door. I stood up, waited, and listened. It was silent again. Very slowly, I peeled back the white curtain that hung over the small window next to the door. What I saw startled me so much I actually stepped back and stumbled over my own untied shoes, falling back into the archway of the living room. My patient was standing on the porch, his pale face peering into the window so close he was almost pressed up against the glass. He honestly looked like he was horrified. I regained my balance, collected myself, and unlocked the door. He didn't move or react. I gently said his name and asked if he was feeling okay. He was shivering, then whispered, "He said you shouldn't be here." I was unnerved and confused. I asked him who he was talking about. There was a long pause where he just stared off into his own thoughts. Then he just shook his head and slowly stepped past me into the house. I locked the door behind him, guiding him back to bed. He laid down without another word, closing his eyes like nothing had happened. I sat awake until morning. His daughter arrived at 7 a.m., thanking me again before I could say anything about what had happened. When I mentioned the back door, she just kind of shrugged, like it wasn't the first time this had happened. I don't know why, but I didn't tell her about the whispers. I didn't tell anyone. I never got assigned to that patient again, and I don't think he lived very long after that. It was sort of a sad situation, but also a haunting reminder of the reality in which many of these patients live out their final days.